Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It is a rare thing for a case to be delivered to Sherlock Holmes, not by telegram, nor by Scotland Yard's weary tread upon the Baker Street stair, but by letter neatly folded, sealed in dark green wax, and delivered. By private courier at 8:15 on a rain-slicked October morning. I was at the table, buttering toast and scanning the Times for mention of the Brackenridge forgery trial, when the envelope arrived. Holmes, cross-legged in the armchair and buried in his third consecutive reading of Goethe's Faust, received the envelope without expression, but as he sliced it open and read its contents, I saw a spark flicker across his face. "This," he said, handing the sheet to me, "is precisely the sort of puzzle the world forgets how to solve." The letter was written in a firm, elegant hand. To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, "I beg your immediate assistance in a matter both private and inexplicable. Last night, between the hours of 11 and midnight, distinct footsteps were heard pacing steadily over the ceiling of the locked library at Witherell Hall. The only problem is that the library is located on the top floor of the house. There is no room above it, nor attic, nor crawl space." The sound continued for nearly 15 minutes, stopping only when my brother, now quite beside himself, forced the door open. Nothing was found, no intruder, no marks, and the windows were still bolted from the inside. I would not trouble you with this if it were not for the second matter, the death of our father 3 days ago. It was sudden, yes, but not entirely unexpected. And yet, something in the timing, and now this madness with the ceiling. I do not believe it to be mere coincidence. Please come. I will explain everything in person. Yours, Algernon Witherell. Witherell Hall, Sussex Downs. "Well," I said, after rereading the strange missive, "a haunted ceiling and a sudden death. What do you make of it?" Holmes leaned back and steepled his fingers. "You recall the case of the woman in Exeter who was found drowned in her drawing-room with all the doors locked?" "Of course," I said. "It turned out the water had been let in from the roof." "Quite right. In matters of so-called impossibility, the mind is often distracted by drama and overlooks what lies directly beneath or above." He stood, brushing imaginary dust from his coat. "Pack for the day, Watson. We are going to Sussex." "But Holmes," I said, gesturing to the paper, "we know nothing yet of the man's death, nor whether these footsteps are not the product of fevered nerves or a mislaid floorboard." "Precisely why we must go," Holmes said with that maddening gleam in his eye. "When the cause is unclear, it is not the facts that deceive us, but the story told about them. And in this case we are walking into a story that appears to be telling itself through footsteps no man could have made." We arrived at Witherell Hall just after dusk. The estate, a sprawling stone manor that stood grimly against the wind-lashed Downs, looked every inch the setting for a Gothic novel. Its gables clawed at the gray sky, and the windows, narrow and diamond-paned, glinted with a cold, watchful stare that Mr. Algernon Witherell greeted us in the drawing-room with the anxious politeness of a man who feared he had already overstepped. He was a tall, sallow fellow, clean-shaven, and prematurely gray, with the air of a man who had spent too long nursing worry and too little time expressing it. "I hope you'll forgive the dramatic tone of my letter," he said, gesturing us toward the hearth. "But I am, as they say, at the end of my rope. You mentioned your father's recent passing, Holmes said. And then these footsteps tell me. Did you hear them yourself? I did. So did my brother Edmund. It was he who insisted it was only the wind. But I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I heard them with clarity, steady, deliberate pacing, directly above the ceiling. A man's stride, 4, 5, 6 steps, pause, then again, as though he were thinking or waiting. And there's absolutely no space above the library? None, he said. The library was once the attic. It's been renovated. Above it lies only slate roof. We've confirmed that there is no one who could have been up there, and no means by which someone could walk those steps. And the door to the library? Locked. My brother carries the only key. He opened it himself. Did you find anything disturbed? Nothing, he said. Books in place. Fire cold. Even the curtains still drawn. Holmes studied him a moment, then asked quietly, And your father? May I ask the nature of his death? With difficulty, Algernon replied. He was found in the very same room 3 days earlier, sitting at the desk, head slumped forward, eyes wide. The doctors said it was his heart, but you don't believe that. I did, until I heard those steps. Then I remembered something else. He had been afraid, Mr. Holmes. Paranoid. He kept the library locked at all hours. Said there were things in the walls. I thought it was nonsense. Now, Holmes rose slowly. Then let us see this library for ourselves. The room in question was located at the rear of the 3rd floor, reached by a long corridor lined with portraits and thick silence. Algernon unlocked the heavy door and swung it open, revealing a chamber that exhaled the scent of old parchment and dried wood. Books lined 3 walls, some sagging with age. A solitary writing desk sat beneath a narrow window, and the ceiling, arched slightly, was smooth plastered and seemingly unbroken. Holmes crossed the room, every movement measured. He ran his fingers along the edges of the shelves, stooped to examine the baseboard, and stood beneath the center of the ceiling, looking up. No dust displaced, he murmured. No cracks, no creak or sag of movement, and yet the sound of a man walking. He turned, suddenly animated. Watson, measure the room's proportions. I did so with a pocket tape, calling out the figures. Holmes nodded, then opened the window and stared upward at the edge of the eaves. Very good, he said. Now, Mr. Witherell, one final question. Yes? Did your father keep any records, ledgers, private journals, architectural documents, anything of the sort? Algernon hesitated. He kept an old ledger in the locked cabinet. We haven't opened it yet. The key was found on his person. Excellent, Holmes said. Let us examine it in the morning. For now I suggest no one sleeps in this part of the house. We may be dealing with more than footsteps, perhaps even a second visit. And with that, Holmes turned from the room with the flick of his coat and the unmistakable air of a man who had already heard the whisper behind the noise. Chapter 2. A most curious ledger. We spent the night not in one of Witherell Hall's guest rooms, but in a modest inn on the edge of the village of preference entirely Holmes. When strange noises plague a house, he had told me during our walk beneath the moonlit hedgerows, it is best to remove oneself from the theater before the performance begins again. Despite the wind whispering through the eaves and the rustle of tree limbs outside our window, I slept soundly, though Holmes remained wakeful. seated upright with his fingers pressed to his temple well into the early hours. When I finally rose at 7:30, I found him already dressed and sipping tepid tea with that distant gleam in his eye, a look I had learned to associate with the birth of some internal hypothesis. "I trust you rested?" he asked without looking up. "Well enough," I replied, though I confess I was half expecting a ghostly footstep myself. Holmes finally turned to me. "The mind has a charming way of borrowing dread from the fears of others, Watson, but ghosts rarely leave ledgers behind, and this morning we must examine one." By 8:30, we were again walking the path to Witherell Hall. Algernon received us in the morning room with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent a life enduring decorum, but was now fraying at the edges. "My brother Edmund left at first light," he told us. "He says he's had enough of this place. I cannot blame him." Holmes made no comment, but requested to be led at once to the locked cabinet in the library. We returned to the upper floor, the morning sun now casting pale slants of light through the narrow library window. Algernon produced a small brass key and opened the cabinet beside the desk. Inside were a handful of aging volumes, ledgers, it appeared, bound in cracked black leather. Holmes took the largest of these and placed it carefully on the desk. The ledger was dusty, and a few pages had curled at the edges, but it opened with ease. The handwriting was neat, angular, and precise, the sort one might expect from a man like Gerald Witherell, whom I was beginning to imagine as methodical, to the point of obsession. "There," Algernon said, pointing. "That's his private accounting. The entries are in his own hand, as far as I know." Holmes turned the pages quickly at first, then more slowly, then stopped altogether. "Watson," he murmured, "come and see." He tapped a line midway down the page. The entry read, "March 4th to £112 withdrawn, cash. Repairs upper beam, southeast quadrant, paid in coin, no receipt. Request no record kept." A curious annotation, Holmes said. "One does not typically make architectural alterations without receipts, nor note the oddity. Does one refer to a specific quadrant of the house in such mechanical terms, unless the house itself is being treated like a system? Southeast quadrant. It's almost militaristic." "I don't see the relevance," Algernon said. "My father was obsessive about maintaining records. Perhaps it was only his way." Holmes closed the ledger gently. "Or perhaps he discovered something, such as—" Holmes stood. "That remains to be seen. But tell me, was any renovation or structural work done in the southeast corner of the library recently?" Well, the eastern shelf was reinforced 2 months ago. A man from the village, Osric Lane, a quiet fellow, worked alone as I recall. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Witherell, I shall need to speak to this Mr. Lane before noon. In the meantime, I would ask that you and any other household staff avoid entering this room. Watson and I must examine the ceiling, and more particularly the roof above it." "You'll find nothing," Algernon said wearily. "There's no access? Then we must create one," Holmes replied. "It took us some time to retrieve a stepladder from the gardener's shed, and more time still to convince the reluctant butler Sims to allow Holmes to unbolt the small panel of wood that sat flush with the far edge of the ceiling. Once opened, a blast of stale air rushed down from the darkness above. Holmes held his lantern aloft and hoisted himself into the narrow void. "Well?" I called. "Join me," came his muffled reply. The crawl space was stifling, barely tall enough to crouch, the slant of the roof beams forcing us to move crabwise. And yet what I saw made the hairs on my arms rise. There, directly above the library, were marks, scuffings in the dust, small splinters of wood shaved along, a narrow joist as though something or someone had moved through this very space. "Note these impressions," Holmes said quietly. "A man light, perhaps under 10 stone, could have made this crossing, given knowledge of where to step. There are no boards here, only beams. To pace evenly across the ceiling would require exceptional balance and silence." He pointed to a rope bolted to the stone at the far end of the space, a makeshift handhold installed for support, possibly during the so-called beam repairs. "And what does it mean?" Holmes narrowed his eyes. "It means," he said softly, "that someone was walking above the library after all, just not as openly as Mr. Witherell feared." Back downstairs, Algernon paled visibly as we described what we'd found. "You're saying someone was in the roof space? But how? There's no way in." "Perhaps not now," Holmes said. "But 2 months ago, when Mr. Lane was paid in cash and asked to keep no record, someone ensured there would be a way. I believe your father knew of this, or discovered it too late." Algernon swallowed. "You think this is how he died?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that he heard the same footsteps you did. But unlike you, he may have recognized them." Chapter 3. A Scene of Deception. The morning passed in a cold wind that pressed against the windows of Witherell Hall like a warning unheeded. Holmes, silent as a monk at vespers, paced the library with glacial patience, pausing now and then to stare up at the ceiling that had so recently revealed its secret. I had seen that look before. A gathering of mental fog that once cleared would give way to blinding light. It was nearly noon when a knock at the front door announced the arrival of Osric Lane. He was a wiry man with calloused hands and soot under his fingernails, his boots worn smooth at the toes. There was nothing extraordinary about him save, perhaps, for the way his eyes flickered quickly about the entrance hall, as if checking that exits remained unobstructed. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, doffing his cap. "Mr. Witherell said you had questions about the work I did for the late master." Holmes extended a hand. "Mr. Lane, thank you for your time. It's a simple inquiry. When you reinforced the shelving in the southeast quadrant of the library, did you access the crawl space above the ceiling?" Lane blinked. "Crawl space? No, sir. Wasn't any access to speak of. I braced the shelf from the side, nothing more." Holmes studied him for a moment, then turned away with deceptive casualness. "Curious, because there is a rope bolted to the stonework in that same quadrant. A fairly recent installation. Surely you noticed it?" Lane hesitated. "Can't say as I did, sir." "No?" Holmes replied mildly. "That is unfortunate. The bolt has traces of lead putty still soft to the touch. Installed, I'd say, no more than 8 weeks ago. That would place it exactly when you were doing your work." Lane licked his lips. I'm just a handyman. I didn't do anything in the roof." "Then perhaps someone asked you to leave it accessible?" Holmes's tone remained cordial. "Or perhaps they paid you in coin with no written record." "I've said enough," Lane muttered. backing toward the hall. "I won't be accused." "Of—" "You are not being accused," Holmes said firmly, stepping forward. "But let me be plain. The late Gerald Witherell appears to have died shortly after that roof space was modified. Whether by fright or design, I do not yet know. But the method, Mr. Lane, that was no accident. Now I suggest you tell us the truth, or the police will ask you themselves." Lane froze. For a moment I feared he might bolt, but then his shoulders slumped. "I was told to drill the bolt. Said it was for securing an attic lamp. Didn't think much of it." "Told by whom?" He hesitated. "Miss Iris, the daughter. We found Miss Iris Witherell in the Rose Parlor, a volume of poetry forgotten in her lap, the fire beside her barely smoldering. She was younger than I had imagined, perhaps 25, with sharp cheekbones and striking gray eyes. There was an intelligence to her expression that did not soften, even when Holmes bowed politely and requested a moment of her time. "You asked Osric Lane to install a bolt in the ceiling of the library," Holmes said directly. She did not deny it. "I did." My father had grown paranoid. He said he heard things at night. I asked Osric to place the bolt there so we might run a line to test the beam's strength. That was all. Holmes tilted his head. "Odd that you did not ask your father's permission." She met his gaze squarely. "If you knew my father, Mr. Holmes, you'd know he had little patience for nonsense. But he wasn't well. I was trying to reassure him. And yet," Holmes continued, "he kept the library locked at all hours, including the night. He died because he was frightened," she snapped. "Not because of me." I could see the tension in her hands, the way her fingers curled against the fabric of her skirt. She was holding something back. Holmes saw it, too. "You found him, didn't you?" he asked gently. "You were the first to discover the body." She nodded once. "Tell me what you saw." She took a breath. He was seated at the desk. His hand was clutching the armrest. His face, he looked terrified, as though something had startled him in his last moments. "Did he leave anything? A note? A message?" She hesitated. "No, nothing." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "You are certain?" "I am." When we stepped back into the hallway, Holmes was silent for a time. Then he turned to me abruptly. "Watson, the deception is beginning to take shape. You think she lied?" "Not entirely. But she omitted something. A half-truth is more dangerous than a full lie. It invites belief while planting confusion." He looked up the staircase, then back toward the library. "I am convinced that Gerald Witherell saw something before his death, something that terrified him into silence. The mechanism by which it occurred is now clear, but the question remains. What did he see? And more pressingly, who made sure he wouldn't live long enough to reveal it? Do you suspect Iris?" "I suspect everyone," Holmes replied, "until they prove themselves incapable of such planning. And we've only just begun to tug at the thread." That evening, Holmes requested the full architectural plans of the house. Algernon, dutiful if still clearly disturbed, produced a rolled vellum from his father's private safe. We unfurled it across the library desk by lamplight. "There," Holmes said, pointing. "Note this corridor leading from the west wing servants' stair to the library's eastern wall." I leaned in. "But there's no door there." "On the plan there is," Holmes replied. "A narrow access panel. Bricked over, perhaps. Or hidden." He tapped it again. If someone wished to spy, to listen, or to frighten, they might make excellent use of such a forgotten passage. And the footsteps? Holmes smiled thinly. Those were for dramatic effect, Watson. Whoever climbed above the ceiling wanted to be heard. He rolled the plans shut. But the next move won't be sound, he said. It will be silence, and we must be listening when it comes. Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects. By the next morning, the fog had returned to the hills around Witherell Hall. It hung over the grounds like a funeral veil, muting even the sound of our footfalls as Holmes and I made our way across the gravel drive toward the garden wing. Holmes had slept little, if at all. He remained in the study until past 3, studying the floor plan and making notes in his pocketbook, his pipe producing a steady stream of smoke, as though it were the very engine of his thought. He now carried that same small notebook under one arm as we stepped inside the conservatory, where Algernon Witherell had assembled the remaining inhabitants of the house at Holmes's request. Though Holmes often worked quietly, without theater, there were moments when he preferred a touch of stagecraft. This was one such moment. There were 5 individuals seated around the glass-domed room, their faces wary, uncertain. Holmes always. The conductor moved to the center of the space without a word and simply stood for a moment, observing each of them. You are all here, he said finally, because your lives intersected that of Mr. Gerald Witherell in more ways than one. Whether by blood, by service, or by sentiment, each of you had something to gain or something to lose. His tone was even, but the words landed with weight. I watched as shoulders stiffened, glances were exchanged, and silence thickened. Holmes turned to the first figure on his left, a tall, spare man in clerical black with deep-set eyes and a mouth that rarely seemed to smile. The Reverend Silas Bray, Holmes said, the village vicar. You were a close confidant of Mr. Witherell's, were you not? Holmes did not press further. Instead, he shifted his gaze to the next figure, a young man with restless hands and an ill-fitting jacket. His blond hair was in need of trimming, and he looked perpetually one question away from bolting. Mr. Percy Finch, Holmes said, the assistant librarian. Finch cleared his throat. I catalogued the books and managed correspondence. Mr. Witherell trusted me. Did he? Holmes asked. He kept the library locked. Even from you? Finch flushed. That was recent. Only since the last few weeks. He said someone had been tampering with his papers. And had they? I wouldn't know, Finch said defensively. But I saw the door ajar once. I thought it odd. That's all. Holmes nodded slowly and moved to the third figure, Miss Iris Witherell. You already know my thoughts on the matter, she said before he could speak. I do, Holmes replied calmly. But now I ask them in front of others. Transparency has its own power. She sat straighter. My father was not an easy man, but he was still my father. I tried to help him when he became fearful. But I wasn't the only one who noticed his deterioration. Holmes offered no comment. Instead, he turned to the next figure, seated with shoulders hunched and a permanently worried brow, Mrs. Wexley, the housekeeper. She had the air of a woman who had spent her life in rooms not her own. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, trembled slightly as Holmes addressed her. You were in charge of the household keys, he said. I was, sir, she replied. But the key to the library, he kept it on his person, day and night. Did you ever see it missing? Her eyes narrowed in thought. only once. The morning he died. I remember it because I found it on the floor outside the drawing room. I picked it up and placed it on the hall table. Curious, Holmes murmured. And was anyone else nearby at the time? She hesitated. Mr. Edmund had arrived. He was coming down the stairs. Holmes gave the faintest smile and turned at last to the final figure, Edmund Witherell himself. The younger brother stood with arms folded, chin raised. There was something wolfish about his bearing, as if he distrusted civility on principle. "I'm told you left the hall early the morning after your father's death," Holmes said. "I did," Edmund replied bluntly. "I had no reason to stay." "No grief?" Holmes asked mildly. He and I hadn't spoken more than a dozen civil words in years. He changed his will, you know, left me almost nothing. There was a murmur from the others. Holmes's eyes twinkled, but his voice remained neutral. That I had not yet heard. "Well, now you have," Edmund said. "I had no cause to kill him. He'd already done the job with that sour heart of his." Holmes took a slow turn around the circle, then folded his notebook and tucked it into his coat. "One of you," he said softly, "knows more than you have said. Perhaps all of you do. But I promise you this. Before the week is out, I shall know who walked over the ceiling of the library. I shall know who frightened Gerald Witherell into silence, and I shall know what secret he died trying to protect." He gave a slight bow and turned for the door. I followed, feeling the tension behind us like a physical force. Only once we were out in the corridor did I speak. "You're convinced the answer lies among them?" "Of course," Holmes said. "This is not a ghost story, Watson. It is a tale of cunning and shadows, and now we have cast a light." Chapter 5. The Red Herring. It was a curious thing. How? Swiftly suspicion could take root in a household where silence had once prevailed. The day following Holmes's confrontation in the conservatory, Witherell Hall grew restless. Conversation ceased the moment one entered a room. Doors were closed a little too quickly. Glances exchanged a little too often. Even the great hound that patrolled the garden paths seemed unsettled. Yet no one appeared more unsettled than young Percy Finch. I first noticed it during breakfast, when the young assistant dropped his fork at the mere creak of the parlor door. He made a feeble excuse about a weak stomach and departed without touching his eggs. Holmes, whose eyes had been half-lidded and uninterested throughout, suddenly straightened in his chair. "That boy," he murmured, "is either frightfully nervous by nature, or something far more instructive has recently visited his conscience." "Do you believe he's hiding something?" I asked. "My dear Watson," Holmes replied, reaching for his teacup, "everyone is hiding something. The question is whether what he hides concerns this case. I propose we find out." By mid-morning, Holmes and I had taken up position outside the study window on the east side of the house. From here, Holmes had calculated, one could observe the path leading toward the south tool shed, an otherwise unremarkable structure nestled among the yews. Finch, it seemed, had made a habit of visiting it every day at 11. It is not part of his official duties, Holmes noted as he adjusted the focus on his field glass, and I highly doubt he's taken up pruning roses in his spare time. At precisely 4 minutes past the hour, Finch appeared, a satchel slung over his shoulder, his gait furtive. Holmes nudged me, and we kept low behind the shrubbery as Finch entered the shed. We waited 5 minutes, then crept forward. The shed was locked. Holmes produced a small tool from his coat and made short work of the latch. Inside, the scent of oil and old wood filled the air. Finch had vanished, but a narrow hatch in the floor told the rest of the story. "A root cellar," Holmes observed, lifting the trapdoor. A ladder descended into darkness. "You're not proposing we follow?" "I'm proposing you fetch a lamp while I go ahead." I sighed, but did as told. When I returned moments later, with a lantern borrowed from the hall, I found Holmes already at the bottom of the ladder, examining something on the floor. "There's a stack of notebooks here," he said without looking up, "hidden beneath a false plank. And here come down, Watson, see for yourself." I descended carefully, and the lantern's glow revealed a crude table piled with documents. Receipts, invoices, and letters all neatly tied and labeled in Percy Finch's careful hand. "These are Withrel's," I said. "His private records." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "Which begs the question, why are they not in the library where they belong?" He began leafing through the top bundle. "Ah, look here. A ledger of estate expenses. Strange entries for cash withdrawals, large sums withdrawn monthly, without notation of purpose. Blackmail?" I offered, "or hush money?" Holmes muttered. "And look here, this envelope is addressed to Reverend Bray." Holmes opened it. Inside was a handwritten note, brief and unsigned. "The secret is not safe anymore. The noise is growing bolder. The rope must be cut before it tightens." "Cryptic," I said. "Indeed." Holmes slipped the note into his pocket. "Enough to warrant a conversation with young Finch, wouldn't you say?" We found him not long after in the reading room, pale and sweating over a leather-bound volume on minor British poets. Holmes closed the door quietly behind him. "Mr. Finch," he said, "we took a look inside your little sanctuary beneath the garden shed. The effect was immediate." Finch stood, knocking over the chair behind him. I can explain." "I sincerely hope so," Holmes said calmly. "Because your activities appear, on first inspection, deeply suspicious. Hiding private documents, concealing notes of an ominous nature, and making daily visits to a locked shed. What are we meant to conclude?" Finch looked from Holmes to me, then back again. His mouth opened twice before he found his voice. "I took the papers to protect them," he burst out. "Mr. Withrel didn't trust the safe in the library. He told me to keep a duplicate record elsewhere. He feared someone in the house was watching him going through his things. That's why he had me install the bolt." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "You installed it? Not Mr. Lane?" "I asked Lane to help with the ceiling struts," Finch said quickly. "But I attached the bolt. Mr. Withrel said he might need to escape through the crawl space if matters worsened." I glanced at Holmes. "An escape route?" Holmes was quiet. Then he said, "And the note to the vicar?" "I don't know about that. He gave it to me in a sealed envelope. Said it was for safekeeping. I never read it until you found it." Holmes tapped a finger on the chair rail, watching Finch squirm. "One more thing," Holmes said. "Did you hear anything unusual the night he died?" Finch looked genuinely troubled. "Yes, I thought I heard movement above my room, which is below the library, but I convinced myself it was the wind, until I heard of his death the next morning." Holmes nodded. "That will be all for now." As Finch left the room, Holmes turned to me, expression unreadable. "Well?" I asked. "He may be telling the truth," Holmes murmured, "but he's still a fool. He allowed himself to be manipulated." "By whom?" "That, Watson, Holmes said, moving to the window, is the question. But I can now see the shape of the trap. Someone planted the notion of fear in Gerald Witherell's mind, nurtured it, and then ensured he would die surrounded by the very terror they created. And the red herring? Holmes smiled faintly. Finch, of course. He was meant to look guilty, just enough to distract us from the real architect. But now, he said, turning back to me with fire in his eyes, we pursue the designer of this ghost story, and we begin with Reverend Bray. Chapter 6. The secret clue. It was nearly dusk when we reached the vicarage, a modest stone house shaded by a row of yews and flanked by narrow beds of foxglove and violets. The evening air was cool, and the sun had begun its retreat behind the crest of the western moor. Holmes knocked once, briskly. The door was opened almost at once by Reverend Silas Bray, who appeared neither surprised nor especially pleased to see us. I expected. Watson and I exchanged glances. The vicar's reply had the ring of truth, and yet Holmes's eyes were fixed on something else, the silver inkwell that gleamed faintly under the lamplight. Tell me, Reverend, Holmes said suddenly, do you often write in the early hours? Bray blanked. No, I rise early but do not work by candlelight. Holmes picked up a small blotter from the edge of the desk and held it to the light, curious. This paper bears the impression of a short note written in haste, and not more than a few nights ago. He tilted it, revealing the reverse impression of the word Titans. Watson leaned closer. The same word used in the note. Bray's expression changed. His mouth tightened, and for the first time a flush of color rose to his cheeks. I did not compose it to frighten him, he said at last, but I did write it. Holmes waited. He was unraveling, muttering about voices, about someone, moving above him at night. I thought if I wrote something cryptic, something to reflect his fears back at him, he might speak plainly to me, or even to his daughter. But instead, he grew more distant. You played upon a madman's dread. To force a confession? Holmes asked, voice low. Bray looked stricken. It was foolish, but I thought perhaps he would face the truth of what he had done. And what had he done? Bray hesitated, then rose and crossed to a narrow cabinet. From it he withdrew a dusty journal bound in red cloth. This was given to me 5 years ago. Gerald asked me to keep it sealed until after his death. But now perhaps it may do more good in the open. Holmes took it, flipping through several pages. Watson and I leaned in. The entries were erratic, some neatly written, others scrawled in the margin, with ink blotted and scratched through. One phrase repeated itself more than once. He never forgave me. The footsteps never stop. This confirms it, Holmes said. Gerald Witherell believed he was being watched, haunted even, not by spirits, but by guilt manifesting as sound. He turned back to Bray. You mentioned he sought absolution. For what? Bray shook his head. He never told me explicitly, but he alluded to a betrayal, a family wound, something done long ago and buried until someone began to remind him of it. Holmes's eyes narrowed. You mean someone within this house? Not a stranger. Bray gave a single nod. Holmes tucked the journal into his coat. Thank you, Reverend. That will be all for now. We walked back through the village in silence. Holmes's stride was quick, his gaze distant. "It fits now," he said suddenly as we passed the churchyard gate. The noises above the library, the shifting will, the locked room, the bolted crawlspace. "You've solved it?" "Not yet, but I know what I'm looking for. A motive wrapped not in greed, but in memory. Someone was deliberately unraveling Witherell's mind, and I intend to know why." We reached the edge of the moor, and the house loomed into view, its tall windows glowing in the dusk. The great roofline like a watchful brow above us. Holmes paused. "One more thing, Watson," he said quietly. "When we return, see if Mrs. Wexley still has the visitor's log from last month." "The guest book?" "Yes. Gerald Witherell may have been haunted by footsteps, but I suspect he let the ghost through the front door." Chapter 7. The Crime Grows Stranger. We returned to Witherell Hall under the weight of gathering mist and suspicion. Holmes's stride was brisk, yet his eyes flicked over the path, the hedges, the windows above, as if reading signs left behind by invisible hands. The manor's gabled silhouette loomed before us, wreathed in a gray that seemed to swallow sound. A candle glimmered in the library window. Inside, Mrs. Wexley was stoking the drawing-room fire when we entered. "Mrs. Wexley," Holmes said without. "Preamble. You mentioned to me once that Mr. Witherell kept a record of visitors. Might I see it?" She hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, sir. It's kept in the parlor cabinet. Mr. Witherell was meticulous about his guests. He liked to note when they came, what they ate, even whether they wore muddy shoes." A few minutes later, Holmes and I sat before the fire, the guest book open across his knees. He flipped through entries with a practiced eye. "Look here, Watson. The last 2 months nearly empty. But note this, a week before Witherell's death, someone signed in as J. Morton, Cambridge. I peered at the neat handwriting. Doesn't strike me as particularly odd." "Nor would it," Holmes replied, "except that no one at the Hall remembers such a guest arriving, staying, or departing. Not even Mrs. Wexley. I checked the accounts. No extra meals served that week. No room linens changed. This Morton fellow is a ghost. You suspect a false name?" Holmes's brows lifted. "Or an unseen presence? Someone who wanted to plant a seed in the records? A phantom visitor? Perhaps even the very footsteps that haunted Witherell's ceiling?" Just then we were interrupted by Lane, the gardener. He stood in the threshold, hat in hand, face pale. "Begging your pardon, sir, but there's something you ought to see." "Out back, near the stables." Holmes rose at once. We followed Lane through the garden and around to the rear of the estate, where the stable doors stood ajar. A bitter wind whipped at the ivy. Lane led us to a heap of straw near the composting trench. "What is it?" I asked. "Found it not 10 minutes ago. Buried shallow. Wouldn't have seen it if the fox hadn't dug some out." Holmes knelt. From the straw, Lane pulled back a sheet of canvas, revealing a bundle of cloth ripped, muddied, and stained. At its center, a cracked riding boot, caked with old blood. Nearby, a scrap of blue tweed. Holmes examined the cloth, then held it to his nose. "Camphor and pipe smoke," he murmured. "Not recent, but unmistakable." Lane scratched his head. "Thing is, no one's been missing clothes, and no one's reported a scuffle." Holmes stood. "Because whoever wore this never intended it to be seen, or perhaps never meant to return to claim it." I crouched beside the boot. "As servants, Boot? Holmes shook his head. Too fine, hand-stitched, gentleman's make, but older resoled twice. He turned to Lane. Tell me, who had access to the stables the night Mr. Witherell died? Lane considered. Must have gone to bed, but I did see Miss Isabel there. Late, said she needed valerian root for her father, kept some in the apothecary cabinet. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Back inside, we crossed the threshold of the library once more. Holmes moved with quiet urgency, examining the corners of the ceiling with a lantern. At last he crouched near the hearth and lifted a brass panel from behind the wainscoting. A crawl-space yawned behind it, barely tall enough for a man to stoop. I suspected as much, he said. This shaft runs above the ground floor, narrow but traversable. Whoever made noise up here did so knowing it would disturb Witherell directly beneath. He pointed to faint impressions in the dust, boot prints, the left heavier than the right, perhaps an injury or imbalance. And look here, Watson, what do you make of this? He held up a brass whistle, dull and bent, the kind used by footmen in larger country estates. A whistle, I said. But wasn't it said that no sound was heard the night of the murder? Just so. This one wasn't used. It was planted. Broken deliberately, perhaps to signify the absence of a warning. The title of our mystery becomes ever more apt. The whistle that wasn't blown, I muttered. Holmes smiled grimly. And its presence here, he said, confirms this was no spontaneous tragedy. This was staged. Our killer wanted Witherell to feel threatened, to panic, to believe his end was coming long before it arrived. Psychological torment, I said. Exactly. Layered deception, Watson. But we must peel deeper. He returned the whistle to his pocket and dusted off his coat. One final thing, he added. This crawl space connects to the east wing, specifically to the corridor where Isabel Witherell keeps her art studio. You think she used it? I think someone used her access. Whether she gave it freely or unknowingly remains to be seen. That night, Holmes returned to the guest book. He tore a page from his pocketbook and began copying the handwriting of J. Morton, Cambridge, stroke for stroke. Forgery? I asked. Comparison, Holmes corrected. If we find another document bearing this hand, we'll know who was lying, and if we don't, he folded the pages neatly. Then we ask who had the most to gain from convincing a dying man that the ghosts of his past had come calling. He turned toward the hallway with the look of a hunter who'd caught a fresh scent. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. By the time morning came, Holmes had already risen and disappeared from the hall. I found a note in his spidery hand awaiting me in the library. Watson, remain close to Miss Witherell today. Speak gently. Observe keenly. I suspect the truth will begin to show its edges. Do not mention the whistle, the guest book, or the boot. I will return before supper. As puzzled but obedient, I sought out Miss Isabel Witherell after breakfast. She was in her studio and airy chamber with slanted windows and the warm scent of turpentine. She stood before a half-finished portrait, brush poised mid her, but not moving. Dr. Watson, she said without turning, do you ever wonder whether art can reveal things its subject never intended? Frequently, I replied, stepping closer. As a doctor, I know a face rarely conceals its inner condition for long. She finally turned, her eyes shadowed. From lack of sleep, I feel as though Father's portrait is changing. I did it from life, you see, but now that he's gone, it looks different." The canvas depicted Gerald Witherell seated in a high-backed chair, his face set in a weary expression, mouth unsmiling, hands gripping the chair's arms with tension. It was a remarkably insightful likeness. "Did he know you were painting it?" I asked. "No." She hesitated, then crossed to a side table and opened a drawer. From it she retrieved a sketch done in charcoal and hurried strokes. It depicted a slanted ceiling, and emerging from the shadows, 2 shoes, the feet of a figure hunched low. "In the crawlspace, I saw it once," she said. "Late at night, a week before Father died. I came down for water and heard the floorboards creak above the library. I went up and caught a glimpse just for a second before it vanished. Did you tell anyone?" "I told Mrs. Wexley. She said it was my imagination." She paused, then added softly, "But I don't think she believed that herself." I was about to press further when a footman entered with word that Mr. Holmes had returned. Holmes met me in the foyer, wind-blown and mud-smeared from travel. "Well?" I asked. "Cambridge yielded fruit," he said. "No record of a J. Morton? Checking in at any local hotels or alumni records. The name is a fiction. But I did find something else, a letter signed by a handwriting nearly identical to that in the guest book, written 10 years ago by a man named Felix Burnham." "Who is he?" "An ex-secretary of Gerald Witherell, dismissed under dubious circumstances, embezzlement, if the family whispers are to be trusted. He vanished shortly after, and was presumed dead in a fire at a seaside inn. But now," Holmes gave a tight smile, "I no longer believe he died. I believe he returned under an alias to exact a long and terrible revenge." "On Witherell?" "Not just him. The torment began with sounds, notes, shadows, meant to unravel a guilty mind. But I believe Burnham is not working alone. He led me to the drawing-room and pulled the guest book from its shelf. 'Observe,' he said, pointing to another entry dated 8 months prior. Signed C. L. Morton. Similar formation, similar strokes. See how the T is crossed with a downward slash?' I nodded. 2 entries months apart, different initials, but the same hand. 2 ghosts passing through the manor unnoticed." Holmes sat and steepled his fingers. "I intend to confront Miss Witherell again, privately. I believe she knows more than she realizes." That afternoon, Holmes asked Miss Witherell to join him in the greenhouse. I watched through the far windows, unseen. Their conversation was inaudible, but I could see the delicate choreography of it. Holmes pacing, pausing, suddenly still. Isabel with arms folded, eyes defiant, then slowly softening. She sat on a low stone bench as he crouched before her. She placed her face in her hands when she rose and turned to go. Holmes remained behind for several moments, lost in thought. Later, in the library, he relayed the essence of what she had revealed. "She admitted she lied," he said. "The night of the murder, she did see someone on the east staircase, but it wasn't a stranger. It was someone she knew. She was afraid to say anything, fearing the scandal would destroy what little family dignity remained." "Who did she see?" Holmes gave me a long look. "That, my dear Watson, is the question I intend to answer tonight. But we must provoke our quarry into making a mistake." After dark, Holmes disappeared into the crawlspace with a candle and notebook, like a fox burrowing into the earth. I was left pacing the corridors, unsure what role I was meant to play until Mrs. Wexley called me to the parlor. "There's been a letter, sir," she said, hands trembling. "Addressed to you. Arrived by boy. No name." I opened it. Inside was a single sentence. "Tell Holmes to stop or the library won't be the only room with a body." Holmes had guessed it would come. But now that it had, the case had crossed a line. Whoever haunted the ceiling was now ready to kill again. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The letter sat upon the mantelpiece like a coiled serpent, its quiet menace sinking deeper into the fabric of the case. Holmes read it in silence, holding the thin paper at arm's length with gloved fingers. I had delivered it to him as soon as he emerged from the crawl space, dust clinging to his coat and streaks of soot darkening his sleeves. "The warning is clumsy," he said at last, "but not without consequence. It confirms our adversary's fear. Something I said or did tonight has pierced their veil of security." We were alone in the library, the lamps dimmed and the air thick with wax and firewood. Holmes turned the envelope over again, holding it toward the flame. No watermark. Common pulp. Ink slightly smeared, written in haste, I believe, under emotional duress. That bodes well for us. Fear makes one reckless. I folded my arms. So what now? Do we inform the police? Post a watch? Holmes shook his head, his expression tightening. "No, Watson. We wait. The spider, when its web is disturbed, will always return to inspect the damage." And so we did. Midnight passed with the house silent save for the gentle ticking of the long case clock in the hallway. Holmes, stretched in the armchair, stared unblinking at the fire, while I stood behind the curtains, peering at the shadowy drive. Just after 1 o'clock, movement stirred on the landing above, the soft tread of slippers, or perhaps stockinged feet. Holmes rose instantly. He pointed to the doorway with a silent gesture. We moved together, cat-like, into the corridor and up the back. Stairs. From there, Holmes indicated the east wing, his brow furrowed in that razor line of intensity I had seen only when lives hung in the balance. We reached the corridor where Isabel's art studio lay. A faint line of light leaked from under the door. Holmes turned the handle gently. The door swung open to reveal Isabel Witherell seated at her easel, though she was not painting. Her eyes were wide and blank. She seemed frozen mid-thought, mid-emotion. The fire in the grate crackled low, but it was not her presence that drew Holmes's attention. It was the window. It stood open. And the rope ladder dangled just outside. It swaying gently in the night wind. Holmes moved with lightning speed. He was through the window in a flash, disappearing down the rope. I dashed to the sill just in time to see a cloaked figure vanishing behind the hedgerow below, Holmes in pursuit. I turned to Isabel. "Miss Witherell, are you well?" She blinked, slowly returning to awareness. I don't know. He was here. He was standing there by the hearth. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I was so afraid. "Who?" I demanded. She clutched the arms of the chair. "He wore a mask, but I saw his hands. They were burned, scarred terribly. He said he needed something. Something her father took from him. Something Gerald Witherell took." She nodded, her voice trembling. He said the whistle was only the beginning." Just then Holmes returned, winded but composed. He knew the terrain too well, he said. Escaped through the eastern hedges and across the frozen creek. But we're not empty-handed." He held up a scrap of cloth, a piece of dark wool, torn from the fugitive's cloak. Embedded in it was a metal button. "Watson," Holmes said, holding it up to the light. "Do you recognize this?" I squinted. Military? Indeed. From a Royal Engineer's dress uniform. Likely repurposed, our villain is no longer a soldier. But this relic tells us who he once was. And perhaps what drives him still. He turned to Isabel. "Miss Witherell, you're safe for tonight. But you must remain under watch. Watson, would you stay nearby?" "Gladly," I said, taking her gently by the arm. "Come, Miss Witherell, let us go to the drawing-room where there's more light." Holmes did not join us, he remained behind, staring at the portrait she had left unfinished, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. At daybreak, Lestrade finally arrived, summoned by Holmes's urgent telegram from hours prior. He looked travel-weary, but alert. "You say there's been another attempt?" he asked as we stood by the stables. Holmes gave a crisp nod. "More than that. An attempt to coerce, to frighten, and to silence. But our man erred. He acted out of desperation. The presence of the rope ladder placed too quickly, too close to the very room Isabel Witherell was known to be in suggests the killer wished to plant fear directly in her heart." Lestrade whistled. "And you think it's the same hand as the Witherell murder?" Holmes gave him a hard look. "I think it's the same mind, Lestrade, and I think the final act is yet to come." That afternoon, Holmes examined the attic above the east wing. He emerged with a battered tin box wrapped in oilcloth. "In the crawlspace above Isabel's room," he said, wedged behind the chimney brick. "Our villain is hiding more than threats. He's storing trophies." Inside the box were two items: a collection of yellowed letters addressed from Gerald Witherell to someone named F.B., and a pocket watch bearing an inscription. 2. Felix Burnham, with gratitude, G.W. Holmes, nodded to himself. The final piece is falling into place, and yet the most chilling discovery came as dusk returned. Mrs. Wexley, while preparing tea, noticed something odd on the back veranda. A feather, then another, then a third bright red and speckled with white. A trail leading from the edge of the library window to the woodshed. Holmes followed it in silence, motioning for us to stay behind. Moments later we heard his voice sharp and commanding, "Put it down, slowly, step into the light." When we reached the door, we found Holmes standing over a figure crouched near the base of the shed. A young boy, pale and frightened, clutching a small cage. Inside was a bird, its wings clipped, its voice silent. "A mockingbird," Holmes said, "with its throat slashed." The boy wept. "He told me to do it. He said if I let it go near the house, and it didn't sing, it would frighten them." Holmes knelt. "Who told you, lad?" The boy shook his head. "He said not to say. He said if I did, I'd end up like the bird." Holmes laid a hand on the boy's shoulder. "No one else will harm you." As he stood, Holmes looked at me, and I saw the grim resolve settle over his features like... Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface the morning after the attack on Miss Witherell dawned bleak and gray, with snow beginning to melt into slush along the gravel paths of Witherell Hall. Holmes, though he had slept not at all, appeared refreshed in mind and purpose. He paced the length of the library, fingers steepled and brow tight with concentration, pausing occasionally to examine the torn button from the cloak. and the letters retrieved from the tin box. "I believe we are close to the heart of the matter, Watson," he said. "Closer than our adversary realizes." He laid out the letters upon the desk, their paper brittle with age. One in particular had drawn his notice dated 15 years prior. "My dear Burnham, you must not return here. It is no longer safe for either of us. What passed between you and my brother was regrettable, but I will not see the family name sullied by scandal. I have enclosed a draft that should cover your needs. Do not write again." Note the tone, Watson," Holmes murmured. Cold, authoritative. Gerald Witherell knew something, and he was not merely buying silence, he was removing a threat to his legacy. "Gerald's brother?" I asked. "But I thought dead, so it was said. But I no longer trust what was recorded, especially when so much hinges on silence." Holmes then held up the pocket watch, showing me the inscription again, to Felix Burnham, with gratitude. Gratitude for what, I wonder? Holmes mused. This was not a keepsake given lightly. Burnham must have once been trusted deeply, perhaps even indispensable to the Witherells. A knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Wexley holding a slip of paper. "This was found in the scullery this morning," she said, "tied to a pheasant feather. I feared it might be meant for you." Holmes took it and read the line aloud. "The past cannot remain buried where birds once sang. Tonight it ends." Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then, folding the note, he turned to me. "Prepare yourself, Watson. I believe we now understand why this began. Now we must determine who, beyond all doubt." We spent the rest of the day retracing the layout of the estate, not merely its rooms, but its timelines. Holmes requested from Lestrade all documentation on Witherell Hall's staff records for the past 2 decades. At length, a name surfaced that jolted our investigation. Charles Lowen, a former groundskeeper, discharged 10 years ago after an unspecified incident with a firearm on the estate grounds. Injuries were reported, but no charges were filed. Curiously, no death record existed for him either, nor did any further employment history. "Lowen is our chameleon," Holmes said. "He vanishes from one role, assumes another perhaps as a servant in another house, or more cleverly, as a guest under an alias. We must re-examine every visitor of the past year." In the meantime, Lestrade called Holmes to a disturbing discovery in the cellar. A short corridor had been concealed behind stacked crates of wine. Within, lit by Holmes' lantern, we found a crude sleeping pallet, a rusted military canteen, and a stack of torn Witherell family photographs, each one defaced, the eyes scratched out with a blade. "Watson," Holmes said grimly, "this was a nest." "Good God," I whispered. "He's been living in the house?" "Or returning to it regularly. Note the dust pattern. This corner was disturbed within the last 48 hours. And this," he said, pointing to the soot along the pipework, "matches precisely the residue found in the crawl space above the library." "But to what end?" I asked. "Revenge, yes, but why now, after all these years?" Holmes turned to me, eyes burning. "Because something changed, Watson. Gerald Witherell was planning to make a confession, or perhaps to reopen a case long thought buried. That threat was enough to provoke a killer to act." He stepped back and drew a long breath. "The original crime is older than the murder we've seen. Gerald Witherell's death was not the beginning. It was the culmination." Later that evening, Holmes requested to speak privately with Isabel. She met us in the solarium, still pale but steadier than before. Her fingers were stained with charcoal. Again she had returned to her sketching, which Holmes took as a hopeful sign. "Miss Witherell," Holmes said gently, "I must ask you something very difficult. Are you aware of anyone your father feared, or more pointedly, someone he wronged deeply?" She looked down. "Father never spoke of enemies. He was a difficult man, but not cruel. Except once." She hesitated, then reached into her sketchbook and retrieved a folded note. "He gave me this the day before he died. Said I was to read it only if something happened to him." Holmes opened it slowly. "Isabel, if I am gone, know this. I tried to make amends. I tried to find him. But the silence is mine to carry, and if he returns, you must not face him alone. The sin was mine." Your father, Holmes, closed the note with great care. "Then he knew," he whispered. "He knew the past was returning, and that its reckoning would be personal." Isabel's voice trembled. "Who is he talking about?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the darkened woods where snow had begun to fall once more. "There's a storm coming," he said at last, "but we now have all the pieces. One more night, Miss Witherell. Let the shadows come to us." He turned to me. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall trap a ghost and expose the living man behind it." Chapter 11. The Bait Holmes Grand Strategy Evening descended upon Witherell Hall with the slow deliberation of a stage curtain falling before the final act. A thin veil of snow covered the grounds, muffling the world in an eerie silence, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Holmes spent the greater part of the day preparing what he only referred to as our net, refusing to share the full plan even with Lestrade, who grumbled loudly about being kept in the dark. "It is a delicate matter," Holmes told him over tea in the drawing-room. "One misstep and our quarry will vanish again, perhaps for good. I trust Watson implicitly. You, Lestrade, I trust provisionally." Lestrade's response was a muttered oath, but he did as instructed. Holmes had secured the cooperation of Mrs. Wexley and a few of the staff, instructing them to act as though nothing unusual had occurred. Isabel, though visibly nervous, agreed to remain in the house and follow a specific pattern of movement. She would retire early, leaving a light on in her studio window, the very same room the masked man had targeted. But she would not be in it. Holmes explained his reasoning as we moved through the hallways that afternoon, inspecting every lock and passage. "Our villain is tethered to this place by two things, a memory and a promise. The memory is painful, and the promise was likely made long ago to punish or reclaim. Tonight we present him with the illusion that he still holds the advantage. You believe he will return to the studio?" "I believe he must," Holmes replied. "The cycle must complete itself. He seeks resolution, Watson, whether in violence or in revelation. Either will suffice for our purposes." That evening, Holmes vanished into the servants' quarters, reappearing 20 minutes later dressed as one of the gardeners, with a wool cap drawn low and soot streaking his jawline. "You shall remain in the corridor outside Isabel's room," he told me. "If he is drawn in, do not interfere unless I signal. The code will be 3 knocks on the wall. If you hear anything else, stay still, and if he brings a weapon, he won't. Not tonight. Not if he believes he's come to speak rather than strike." The plan was simple on its surface, and yet the tension that gripped the house was anything But the hours crawled by. At 11 o'clock, the house fell into an artificial hush. The lights dimmed. The decoy lamp in the studio window glowed steadily. I took my place outside the door, revolver at the ready, though Holmes had specifically told me not to use it unless absolutely necessary. He had disappeared behind the false wall paneling he had discovered 2 days prior, squeezing himself into the narrow passageway that ran from the attic to the east wing. Then we waited. It was a little past midnight when I heard it, a soft creak along the floorboards, too calculated to be casual. The footfalls paused just beyond the corner and the shadowed stretch of corridor. A breath, then movement deliberate, slow, nearly silent. The figure emerged from the dark like a revenant, gloved hand brushing against the wallpapered edge of the studio door. The man wore no mask this time. His face was gaunt, hollow-eyed but unmistakably familiar. I had seen him in a portrait in the hall, though much younger and far less haunted. The resemblance to the Witherells was striking. Felix Burnham. He did not enter the studio immediately. He paused, fingers trembling, as though warring with himself. Then he stepped inside. Seconds passed. I could see the shadows shifting under the door, hear the rustle of cloth, and then 3 soft knocks. I burst in. Holmes had already emerged from the panel behind the curtain, and Burnham stood frozen by the hearth, an envelope in one hand, his eyes wide not with fear, but with resignation. It was always going to end like this, Burnham murmured. Holmes held up a hand to me. Watson, no need for force. He is unarmed. Why? I asked. Why return? Burnham looked at the floor, his voice hollow. Because he promised to help me. Gerald. He promised he'd make it right. And then he buried me. Buried me with lies and bribes and silence. Holmes gestured to the envelope. The letters? They're mine. From when I lived here. When I worked with him, I was a foundling. A gifted one, he said. He taught me everything engineering, structure, estate, design. I helped him build this house into a fortress of secrets. I knew every beam. He looked up and his voice grew strained. But when I found out, he made me promise, she said, never to take revenge with violence, and I never intended to. But after Gerald's death, I saw an opportunity. While Felix remained in hiding, I came as a maid under the name Ava Barnes. I worked here, briefly, long enough to search the East Wing and the library. But what I needed wasn't there. Holmes's eyes narrowed. You were the one who planted the whistle. She gave a curt nod. Yes, I left it in the drawer before I vanished. I believed Felix would understand my message, that the past had finally come full circle. I didn't anticipate that he would act with such theatricality. You manipulated a child to act as your herald, I said coldly. No, she replied. That was Felix's doing. He found the boy on the outskirts of the village, brilliant mimic, but slow-minded. He thought it would help confuse the narrative, make the estate seem haunted. Felix never knew I'd already been inside. And the letter to Gerald? Holmes asked. The final threat? I wrote it, she said, but too late. He was already dead. It was never meant for the courts. It was meant for his conscience. Lestrade, who had been fidgeting in the corner, now spoke sharply. So what are we to make of this, Holmes? Is she guilty of a crime or just a phantom? Chasing old ghosts? Holmes turned to me. Watson, What was it that struck you most about Miss Burnham's arrival? I blinked. The familiarity of her gaze. Precisely, Holmes said. Because she bears the exact same eyes as Isabel Witherell. Evelyn looked away. Holmes stepped forward. Half-sisters, born of the same man, cast in different shadows, and yet one grew up in privilege, the other in exile. That injustice is what built the framework of this case. Not jealousy, not greed. Balance. Evelyn said nothing. Lestrade scratched his chin. Still doesn't change the fact that she snuck into this house under false pretenses, planted evidence, and tampered with witnesses. Holmes nodded. True, but given the sensitive nature of the Witherell name and the absence of criminal intent, I suspect the family solicitor will be quite interested in resolving this quietly. Lestrade gave a grunt. Fine, let me fetch Miss Witherell. I think it's time these two had a word. The meeting between Evelyn and Isabel took place in the drawing room without witnesses. Holmes and I waited just outside the door. No voices were raised, no weeping heard. Only the sound of low murmuring and once a quiet laugh that sounded like shared recognition. When the door opened, both women emerged solemn but composed. Isabel turned to Holmes. She'll stay, at least for now. I think my father owes her that much, even from beyond the grave. Holmes inclined his head. You have chosen wisely, Miss Witherell. Evelyn said nothing. But as she passed us, she turned and whispered, just loud enough for Holmes to hear. You were never supposed to see the ending. But I'm glad you did. And then she disappeared once more into the snow-lit hallway, leaving only the faintest impression in the carpet where she had stood. Chapter 14. Holmes closes, and the final clue revealed the events of that night had shaken the household to its foundation. Yet the strange quiet of the following morning bore the feeling not of peace, but of tension wound tight, waiting for Holmes to strike the final note. Isabel remained secluded in her chambers. Evelyn, we were told, had taken a solitary walk through the eastern garden and had not returned. Lestrade, his patience worn thin, prowled the halls muttering of forged identities and undue sympathy for poetic criminals. Holmes, however, was more energetic than I had seen him since our arrival. He moved through the rooms of Witherell Hall. Like a bloodhound on a scent, his steps swift, his remarks clipped but precise. I followed him with notebook in hand, half out of habit, half in an attempt to piece together the scattered fragments of the past days. We have misread the tone of this play, Watson, he declared in the upper corridor as he tapped the banister with his walking stick. We believed ourselves to be watching a tragedy, but in truth it is a farce dressed in mourning clothes. I stared at him. You've lost me again, Holmes. Then let me restore your bearings. Consider, if you will, the exact layout of this house. The library beneath which the footfalls were heard, the east wing sealed but not silent, the servants' corridors barely used for years, all designed not for comfort but for concealment. Designed? I repeated. Yes, Holmes said. And by whom? Gerald Witherell was no architect, but he was a man with means and a paranoid streak. He halted suddenly before a carved panel near the grand stair. Note this, he said, tapping it. The grain is newer, the varnish more recent, and yet it has been deliberately dusted to match the surrounding wood. Before I could respond, he pressed gently against the panel, and it gave way with a soft click. A narrow passage revealed itself beyond. We descended slowly, the air growing colder with each step. At the end of the stair was a stone cellar not listed on any blueprint I had seen. It was not a wine cellar nor a storage space, but something else entirely. The floor was bare earth. The walls lined with discarded portraits and trunks. Holmes stooped beside a half-opened trunk and lifted something out, a crumpled bundle of fine fabric wedding lace, stained with age. On top of it rested a photograph, yellowed at the corners. A woman's face stared out young, proud, eyes blazing. "Emily." "Burnham," Holmes said softly, "unwilling to be hidden, and yet buried here." He turned over the photograph. On the back was a scrawl in faded ink. She warned me. I should have listened. Holmes tucked the image into his pocket and looked up toward the ceiling. "Do you hear that?" I listened, heart quickening. A faint creak, almost imperceptible. "Someone above us," I whispered. Holmes nodded. "In the library." We climbed quickly back to the main floor, emerging silently into the great room that had once seemed so grand, but now felt like a hollow. Stage. The morning light filtered through the high windows, catching on the motes that danced through the air. Holmes raised a finger for quiet and motioned toward the far bookshelf dot. At first I saw nothing. Then, as he stepped forward and lightly tapped a lower shelf, the wood shifted. A narrow segment of the wall opened like a hidden door dot inside. Crouched within a cavity no larger than a cupboard sat the boy Ewan the child Felix had recruited. His eyes, wide and glassy, stared at us with that same blank mimicry. In his hands was the silver whistle. "Ewan," Holmes said gently, kneeling beside him. "Who told you to stay here?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Eva." Holmes glanced at me. "Not Evelyn. Eva Barnes, the identity she used. She trained him to remain hidden and appear when summoned. But why still hide now?" I asked. "Because she told him the game wasn't over." Holmes coaxed the child from the compartment and led him gently to a chair by the hearth. He then turned to Lestrade, who had just entered behind us. "I believe," Holmes said, "that we have found the final missing piece." Lestrade stared. "Bad boy, but he's no criminal." "No," Holmes agreed. "But he is a witness, the most important one. Evelyn used him not only to seed confusion, but to mask her own presence, appearing at moments when no one could account for her, then vanishing again into obscurity." "And the sound in the ceiling?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Footsteps, yes, but not spectral. They were the boys following Evelyn's instructions. The false haunting was never meant to frighten. It was meant to distract." Lestrade rubbed his forehead. "So what does it all amount to, Holmes? Burnham's dead. Gerald's dead. We have a woman who never broke the law outright, and a boy who was following orders." Holmes stepped to the center of the room. "It amounts," he said, "to a story that was nearly rewritten. But the truth was buried here, in the walls and beneath the floors. Evelyn sought no fortune. She wanted only for the world to remember that her mother had lived and had been wronged." He retrieved the photograph once more and placed it on the mantel. "This was the final clue," he said. "A memory preserved in secret, kept from view but never destroyed. Gerald Witherell may have tried to erase Emily Burnham, but his guilt could not let him fully succeed. That photograph is what undid him." Lestrade looked weary. So what happens now? Holmes turned to the fire, his voice quieter. Now, we prepare the truth for those who will listen, and we leave the rest to those whom the past has not forgotten. Chapter 15. The final gathering, the drawing room of Witherell Hall. Once a site of opulent social affairs, now bore the weight of a solemn tribunal. Holmes had requested that every principal figure connected with the events of the past week gather there before sundown. The fire was stoked to a steady roar. Outside, the dusk deepened into a velvet shroud. Inside, tension clung to the air like damp wool. Isabel Witherell sat composed but pale in a high-backed chair, her fingers interlaced tightly. Evelyn Burnham leaned against the far wall, face unreadable, eyes trained not on the others, but on the ornate mirror above the hearth. Inspector Lestrade stood near the sideboard, arms crossed, every inch the watchdog uncertain whether to bite or merely bark. Beside me, Holmes stood as still as marble, hands folded behind his back. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began at last, "I have called you here because a puzzle, long obscured by grief, deception, and silence, has resolved itself almost. But before I draw the curtain, let us walk together once more through the path we took to reach this precipice." No one spoke. Gerald Witherell was found dead in this very house under circumstances meant to suggest suicide. A pistol in his hand, a torn letter nearby. The implication was clear, a man driven to despair by threats again. But from the outset, details rang false. The position of the body unnatural, the angle of the wound unconvincing, and most curiously, the whistle. He glanced toward Evelyn, who gave the barest flicker of a nod. The silver whistle left. In the drawer was no weapon, but a signal, a remnant from the past placed with deliberate intent to draw out old ghosts. For that, we turned to Miss Burnham. All eyes shifted toward her. She did not come to Witherell Hall for riches, Holmes sighed. She came for justice or perhaps memory, to disturb the polished narrative the Witherell family had long preserved. She entered under disguise, left signs, planted doubt, but she did not kill Gerald Witherell. A murmur rippled through the room. She could have, Holmes continued, but she chose not to. Because, as it turns out, she wasn't the only one watching Gerald Witherell's carefully constructed world. Holmes turned toward Lestrade. "You recall the post-mortem, Inspector? Trace amounts of powdered chloral hydrate enough to cause drowsiness, not death." Lestrade blinked. "Yes, but there were no signs of ingestion." "Precisely, which means it was administered by contact, absorbed most likely through the skin. A transfer from an object, a decoy, perhaps passed to him by someone trusted." Isabel straightened in her chair. "Are you saying he was drugged? Before the shot?" Holmes nodded. "He was mildly. Just enough to disorient him. Which raises a compelling question. If Gerald did not kill himself, who fired the fatal shot?" The silence was profound. Holmes moved again, slowly to the hearth. "The answer lies not in motive, but in access. Only one person, aside from Evelyn, had consistent, unsupervised contact with Gerald Witherell in the days before his death. Only one person he trusted implicitly." He turned toward the door. "Mrs. Penley." A gasp escaped Isabel's lips. At that moment, the door creaked open, and the housekeeper herself appeared in the threshold. She had been summoned, but clearly did not expect to be addressed so directly. Her eyes darted to Lestrade, then to Isabel. "Sir?" she said, voice clipped. Holmes gestured. "Please join us." She stepped in slowly, every inch a loyal servant, until Holmes continued. "Your devotion to the Witherell family was not in doubt, but your past was. Before you became Mrs. Penley, you were Margaret Dean, a name forgotten by most, but not by Felix Burnham. You were once a companion to Emily Burnham in her last years, until she died, alone and unrecorded." The color drained from her face. She confided in you. You knew the truth, that she had been cast aside, that the man responsible now lived in comfort behind locked gates. And when you came here, years later, as housekeeper, you did not do so by accident. She started, but the words broke off. Holmes's tone remained calm, almost gentle. "When Evelyn planted the whistle, you saw your moment. You drugged Gerald's drink with the powdered chloral she left behind. When he retired early, that night you entered through the side stair, using the key kept for emergencies. You placed the pistol in his hand, guided his arm, and—" "No," she cried suddenly. "It wasn't murder. He was already dying. He knew it. He said he couldn't live with it anymore. He asked me to help him." A stunned silence followed. Holmes gave a slow, sad nod. "Then it was a mercy, not a vendetta." Isabel rose shakily to her feet. "Is that true? He asked you?" Penley turned to her, trembling. He couldn't breathe anymore. Guilt was choking him every day. When the letter came, he said it was time. Said he didn't want to face another trial, another scandal. He just wanted to end it on his terms. I couldn't say no. Lestrade stepped forward. "You understand, Mrs. Penley, that even if it was assisted, it's still—" "I'll go quietly," she said, but Isabel intervened. "No, we'll say nothing. The scandal would kill what little remains of our name. She stayed here all these years. She cared for him. That must count for something." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to the fire and added softly, "Justice comes in many guises. This one arrived not with vengeance, but with silence." Chapter 16. The reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. The hearth crackled, its orange glow flickering against. The somber faces gathered in the drawing-room. Holmes had assumed his familiar stance by the mantel, one hand tucked behind his back, the other gesturing with gentle rhythm as he began to untangle the strands of the case. Watson sat with his notebook open, his pen poised, though he knew that what was about to unfold would be etched into his memory far more indelibly than onto paper. "Let us begin," Holmes said, "not with the death of Gerald Witherell, but with the life of Emily Burnham." Evelyn stirred but said nothing. She was promised marriage by Gerald nearly 30 years ago, only to be abandoned when social pressure outweighed moral obligation. Left alone, she bore a child, Evelyn, whom she raised under a different name to avoid scandal. The Witherells never acknowledged her. He turned to Isabel. "Your brother buried that truth, did he not?" She nodded, tears standing in her eyes. He forbade her mention. Holmes continued. "Gerald believed, wrongly, that money and time would erase the past. But it does not fade so easily, especially not for those who carry it in their blood. Evelyn returned to this house not for wealth, but to force a reckoning. She came under the alias of Eva Barnes, and took employment as a secretary in the village where Felix Burnham lived. There she found young Ewan. He gestured toward the boy, now dozing in a nearby armchair, oblivious to the storm that had revolved around him. She trained him carefully, taught him to follow silent commands, to appear only when summoned, and above all, to remain unseen. This child, mute and pliable, became her instrument. He was the ghost of Witherell Hall, the footsteps above the ceiling, the fleeting glimpses through doorways. His presence served one purpose, to instill unease. Watson leaned forward. So Evelyn orchestrated the haunting? Yes, to make Gerald doubt his sanity, to rattle his fortress of denial. She wanted him to see through fear what he had, refused to admit that the past had returned to claim its voice. But while Evelyn's methods were dramatic, they were not fatal. He paused, eyes narrowing. The actual death was caused by another. He turned to Mrs. Penley. Margaret Dean, former companion to Emily Burnham? You took this position as housekeeper deliberately, biding your time. Evelyn's appearance brought the past roaring back. You saw the opportunity not to avenge Emily, but to fulfill what you believed to be Gerald's final wish. Penley bowed her head. He begged me. He said it was the only way left. Holmes inclined his head, and so it was done. A light dose of chloral hydrate slipped into a nightcap provided by Evelyn and left behind days earlier. Then, when he dozed in his chair, you staged the suicide, placed the pistol, positioned the letter, even folded his hand around the weapon. Lestrade cleared his throat. But why the whistle? Holmes smiled faintly. That was Evelyn's contribution. Final symbolic act. A silver whistle, meant to summon justice, placed where only a guilty conscience might find it. It was not evidence, but a message. He stepped to the center of the room. This case, gentlemen, was never about robbery or rivalry. It was about remembrance. Every false lead, every sound in the ceiling, every flickering candle, every whisper was a carefully laid brick in a narrative designed to disturb complacency. He turned to Evelyn. And yet you never intended violence. She met his gaze. No, I only wanted him to see me to say her name. Just once. He did, said Isabel softly, the night before he died. He said, Emily. I was standing outside his door. Evelyn closed her eyes, exhaling as if the very breath had waited years to be released. Holmes turned once more to the room at large. Every suspect in this affair played a role, whether consciously or not. Scotland Yard looked for motive in money, but the true currency here was memory, and the lengths to which people will go to either bury or revive it. There was silence for a long moment. Then Holmes spoke once more, voice quieter. And so, what began as an impossible mystery ends as a deeply human one. Gerald Witherell died not by a stranger's hand, but at the consequence of his own past. Evelyn Burnham sought not revenge but recognition, and Mrs. Penley acted from loyalty, however misguided. Watson finally spoke. And what of the law? Lestrade sighed. If I bring in anyone, it will be an old woman acting out of mercy, and a daughter looking for a name. I think we can leave this one unwritten. Holmes nodded. A wise decision, Inspector. Justice, this time, is better served by discretion. The fire crackled. Outside, a light drizzle began to fall, soft, persistent, like a veil slowly washing the past away. Chapter 17. Outcome and justice, the storm, which had hung low and heavy over Witherell Hall for days, had finally broken. The rain came steadily, now its persistent rhythm tapping on the long gallery windows and flowing in quiet rivulets down the stonework. A strange calm had settled over the manor, as though the house itself had sighed at last. The events of the night before had left a deep impression upon all present, none more so than Inspector Lestrade, who lingered longer than usual the following morning. He had taken his tea alone in the breakfast-room, occasionally tapping his fingers on the rim of his cup, clearly wrestling with the question Holmes had already answered the night before. How does one write justice into a report when the truth lies outside the neat lines of the law? "Will you report Mrs. Penley?" I asked as I joined him. He glanced up, the morning paper folded beside him, unread. "What would be the point, Doctor? The man is dead. The woman is no threat. If you—" He looked up, and his voice grew strained. "But when I found out what he had done to my mother, how she died, how he had cast her aside, he wanted me gone. He offered money. I refused. So he had me removed. They said I shot at him. Lies." Holmes crossed his arms. "And so you returned to the only place that would still whisper your name." Burnham gave a broken laugh. "I never left, not truly. I watched them sell my mother's piano. I watched Isabel grow up with his blood in her veins. I couldn't touch any of it. Until he died." He gestured again to the letter he had left for Isabel. He did try to make it right at the end, but by then it was too late. I had already placed the whistle. "The whistle," Holmes said softly, "which never blew. I meant it to. A signal to the man in the attic. Me. A final confrontation. But he died too quickly." Holmes stepped forward. "And the boy in the woodshed? The mockingbird?" "I told him stories, fed him lies. He didn't know what he was doing." "You manipulated a child to create fear," I said. Burnham looked at me with dead eyes. "And did it work?" Holmes lowered his gaze. "You wanted a reckoning. Tonight you shall have it. But not the one you envisioned. Lestrade is waiting." The inspector arrived with a pair of constables, and Burnham was taken without resistance. Isabel, awakened and pale, stood watching from the stairwell. Holmes approached her gently. "There will be no more footsteps above your ceiling, Miss Witherell." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "But the secrets below," she whispered, "may never be fully silent." Holmes offered no answer. He merely turned and vanished into the library, where the ashes in the grate still glowed faintly red. Chapter 12. The moment of recognition the following morning dawned pale and frost-laden, with the early light filtering through the mullioned windows of Witherell Hall in ribbons of silver. Holmes, seated once more in the library armchair, was unusually silent. He held in his hands a single page, one of Burnham's letters, its edge torn and soot-smudged, as though it had only barely escaped the flames of some intended destruction. I had risen early, restless after the night's revelations, and found him there in that familiar pose, fingertips pressed together, eyes half-lidded, but with a tension in his posture that told me the case, for all appearances, was not yet finished. In his mind he told the truth, I ventured. At least in part. The man had been hiding in the bones of this house. It's a miracle he lasted this long. Holmes did not look up. Miracles are rarely miracles, Watson. More often they are careful arrangements concealed in shadows. I frowned. You still doubt him? I do not doubt the pain in Felix Burnham's voice. I do not doubt his resentment or his skill. What I do doubt is that he worked entirely alone. I leaned forward. You think he had an accomplice? Holmes finally raised his eyes. Not an accomplice in the usual sense. A puppet, rather. One he could guide from afar. But more importantly, someone guided him. He laid the letter down between us. Read this passage. I did as instructed, ... and so I held the draft in my hand, torn as I was between bitterness and necessity. But even then I hesitated, not because I feared him, but because of what she had whispered to me before she vanished, that the sins of men do not fade with money, and that someone would always return to remind him of them. She? I asked. Who is he referring to? Holmes was quiet a moment longer, then rose and walked toward the hearth, where a fire now crackled gently. He retrieved a sketch from the mantel, one of Isabel's earliest charcoal renderings. A woman's face, serene, her features classical and strong, and unmistakably Withrow in bone structure. I had wondered, Holmes said softly, at the lack of any record of Gerald Withrow's first wife. No portrait, no letter, no obituary. Her name was Emily Burnham, and I suspect she was Felix's sister, or at least of close kin. But no one spoke of her. No, Holmes said, because she disappeared. Gerald remade his life and house, casting aside what was inconvenient. Burnham never forgave that. But I think it was Isabel, the child who resembled both sides of the legacy, that kept him tethered here. A silence settled between us. Then I asked, what of the incident 10 years ago, the firearm, the supposed attack on Gerald? Holmes shook his head. That was not Felix, or rather it was not meant to be Felix. It was a staged event, something concocted by Gerald to rid himself of a growing threat without legal consequence. He gave the staff a name, and that name was allowed to disappear. Then Burnham lived beneath a house that had tried to erase him. Yes, Holmes said. And while that would drive many to madness, it made Felix meticulous, patient, but not perfect. Holmes then took out the whistle from the tin box, the one that had never been blown. He placed it on the table beside the letter. It was meant to be a symbol, he said. But what if it was also meant to summon someone? The man in the attic, the boy in the shed, the servant who came and went without notice. I blinked. You mean he was waiting for someone else to act? Precisely. But that person never came. Why? I had no answer. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a second envelope. This was delivered to Lestrade early this morning by a courier, postmarked yesterday. It was meant to reach Gerald Withrow, though by then he was already dead. He unfolded it and read aloud, Your silence will not protect you. The blood you buried has roots, and they grow in darkness. If you do not confess, I shall unearth everything myself. E.B.? I said, Not Felix? Holmes shook his head. No, I believe we were wrong in assuming Felix wrote all. The letters. This one came from someone else entirely. But who? Holmes stared into the fire. The final player, he said. The one we have not yet seen. Just before midday, Lestrade returned from town with news. We've confirmed it, he said. Felix Burnham was indeed listed as deceased in the hospital ledgers. Cause of death, accidental fire in a boarding house in Camden, 1897. But the record was faked. The attending doctor, no longer licensed. Paid off to record a name that would erase a man. Holmes nodded. And that was Gerald's doing? Likely, Lestrade replied. But what's interesting is that the name on the lease for that boarding house was a woman, Emily Burnham. Watson looked sharply at Holmes. The sister? Or wife, Holmes said quietly. Which means she survived longer than anyone believed. Long enough to leave instructions. Perhaps even long enough to raise someone else. Lestrade frowned. You think there's another Burnham? I think, Holmes said, that Felix was not acting alone, not just in the sense of logistics, but in purpose. He was finishing a task set in motion by someone he loved, but that person left behind another who has not yet stepped forward. Later that night, while Watson retired to his guest room and Lestrade drank brandy by the fire, Holmes remained seated in the window nook of the library. The tin whistle lay beside him, untouched dot. Suddenly, from the darkness, came the crunch of a footfall on the gravel path outside. Holmes did not move. He waited, another footstep, then silence. A soft tapping came at the window. Holmes turned slowly. There, framed in the snowy dark, was the silhouette of a woman. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. The figure at the window did not flinch when Holmes met her gaze. She stood with a composure that struck me when Holmes later recounted it as entirely unnatural for someone appearing on the frost-glazed lawn of a manor house after midnight. Her silhouette, cloaked in a long wool coat, stood against the dim glow of moonlight reflected off the snow. She made no sign of fear or urgency. Only her eyes moved, tracking Holmes through the pane. Holmes rose and, without a word to Lestrade or me, who had just emerged into the room with a half-folded newspaper, crossed the carpet and unlatched the window. The woman stepped inside with ghost-like grace. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with ash-blonde hair pinned tightly under a scarf, and a complexion almost startlingly pale in the firelight. Her eyes, however, were what seized my attention, sharp, unblinking, and strangely familiar. She said only one thing, "You have my letter." Holmes closed the window behind her. "Miss Burnham, I presume?" She gave the slightest nod. Lestrade. He frowned. "Wait, Burnham?" "Not another one." Holmes raised a finger to still him, his tone grave. "I believe, Inspector, that we are at last in the presence of the true heir to this mystery." The woman removed her gloves slowly, like a ritual. "My name is Evelyn Burnham. Felix was my uncle. Emily Burnham, his sister, was my mother. She died when I was 14. And Gerald Witherell?" I asked. Her lips curled with something too thin to be called a smile. "My father, though he never once acknowledged. He arranged for my mother's disappearance under the guise of charity. She died in a sanatorium, deliberately forgotten. He paid to erase her. And Felix saved me from vanishing the same way." Lestrade interjected. "And yet you waited until he was gone to make yourself known." Holmes gestured for calm. "Because she never intended to confront Witherell. That was Felix's burden. Hers was something else entirely. Isn't that right, Miss Burnham?" She nodded. "I came here to retrieve what is mine." Holmes tilted his head. "Your birthright?" "No," she said. "The truth." As the fire crackled low, Evelyn Burnham laid out her tale with remarkable clarity. After her mother's death, she had been placed with distant relatives in Derbyshire, but Felix, having tracked her down, took her under his protection. He trained her mind, fed her books on logic, memory, and disguise, not in pursuit of vengeance, but in preparation. They both knew the day would come when the house that had cast I suspect Holmes had hoped you'd say that. Lestrade gave a dry chuckle. Holmes never hopes. He expects. That's the infuriating thing about him. In the hallway, Holmes was speaking softly with Evelyn. She stood composed, her gloved hands resting on the handle of a small satchel. Young Ewan stood beside her, clutching a cloth-bound book. Holmes had given him one of Grimm's fairy tales, if I recalled correctly. "You've made arrangements?" Holmes asked her. Evelyn nodded. "The boy and I will return to Derbyshire. There's a small cottage left to us by my mother's cousin. It's quiet. He'll do well there." Holmes tilted his head toward the child. "He may not remain silent forever, Miss Burnham. Sometimes silence is not a defect, but a shield." She smiled, then extended a hand. "Thank you for seeing the truth. I merely walked where the evidence led. It was you who left the trail." With a final nod to both of us, she took Yuan's hand and departed through the main doors. The boy turned once, offering me a curious look, half grateful, half unknowable, and then they vanished into the gray morning mist. Later that day, Mrs. Penla came to Holmes and me in the library, where we sat with our bags nearly packed. "I've written my resignation," she said without preamble. "Miss Witherell has accepted it. Just say I'm retiring to the coast." Holmes looked up from his newspaper. "Will you?" "I might," she said, with a trace of wistfulness. "Or I may finally return to my sister in Shropshire. I've kept her waiting long enough." There was a silence. Then Holmes rose, crossed the room, and placed a small parcel in her hand. She looked down. "What is this?" "A locket," he said simply. "It belonged to Emily Burnham. Evelyn found it in Gerald's desk drawer. He had kept it all these years." Mrs. Penley's face tightened. She nodded once and left the room without another word. That afternoon, as our carriage pulled away from Witherell Hall, I looked back at the looming facade, its gables sharp against the cloud-choked sky. "So much for ghosts," I murmured. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He was watching the windows, as if expecting something more. At last, he said, "The human mind, Watson, leaves deeper footprints than any ghost." The child's steps above the ceiling were light, but gilt echoes. We rode in thoughtful silence back toward London. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the fire in our hearth had long gone cold. Mrs. Hudson bustled about restoring order, and I, in turn, sat with my notes, trying to make sense of a mystery that had touched deeper nerves than most. Holmes sat in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you?" I asked. I suspected. A man as self-contained as Gerald Witherell does not scatter pieces of himself without reason. The whistle, the letter, those were not cries of despair, Watson. They were invitations. He wanted someone to find him, to stop him. "No," Holmes said, "to witness him. There's a difference." "And what of Evelyn?" "She got what she came for. Not justice, but visibility. Her mother's name restored, her own identity reclaimed. And as for Ewan, well, perhaps a storybook and a quiet life will do more for him than any courtroom." "Could." I set my pen down. "It was one of your more melancholic cases." Holmes smiled faintly. Not all mysteries end in triumph, Watson. Some end in quiet mercy, and those, I find, are often the most difficult to unravel. Chapter 18. Holmes' Final Reflection. It was a week after our return to Baker Street, and the cold spell that had hung over London like a mournful veil had lifted at last. A clear sky crowned the city, and the soot-slicked chimneys now issued only faint wisps of smoke in the light breeze. Even in Baker Street, the mood had shifted, though in Holmes's sitting room, the change was more subtle. I found him that morning, as I often did, reclined in his armchair, a newspaper open on his lap, but unread. His gaze was fixed upon a single object placed on the corner of the table. The silver whistle dot it had arrived by post, unwrapped, with no note. Holmes had retrieved it from the hearthside table in Witherell Hall before we departed, and had evidently sent it on to Miss Evelyn Burnham. Now it had returned. "She sends it back," I said, reading his thoughts. He nodded slowly, as I suspected. "Its purpose is fulfilled. The silence that once smothered her life has been broken. She no longer needs a symbol to speak for her." There was a long pause. "And what of the others?" I asked. "Miss Witherell, Mrs. Penley?" "Miss Isabel is to remain at the Hall for now, though she has expressed intentions to convert a portion of it into a home for children orphaned by the war. She has, it seems, learned from her brother's errors in silence." "And Mrs. Penley?" "Gone. To Shropshire. She wrote to me once. Said she sits each morning by the river, listening for footsteps on the water. A curious metaphor, though not without beauty." I glanced at the locket now resting atop Holmes's violin case. A tiny portrait of a young Emily Burnham was still visible within. "You often speak of the mind as a blade," I said. "Precise, unforgiving, but in this case you used it with restraint." Holmes gave a wry smile. "Even a scalpel must be sheathed when the surgery is complete, Watson. There was no villain in the traditional sense, only human frailty, and a web of memory, guilt, and silence too long sustained." I stirred the fire absently. "You said something back at Witherell Hall about guilt echoing." Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Yes, it echoes, Watson, and often not in the place where it was born. The footsteps above the ceiling were not merely those of a child. They were the sound of a life left unacknowledged. Gerald Witherell was not murdered by poison, nor driven to death by fear. He was undone by memory made manifest by Evelyn's cleverness and Penley's loyalty." "And you, Holmes?" I asked. "Do cases like this ever echo in you?" His gaze turned sharp for a moment, then softened. "I am a violin, Watson. I vibrate to the resonance of truth. Some truths ring clear and clean. Others are dissonant. This was one such." He rose, taking the whistle in hand. He examined it closely, then turned to the fire. Without a word, he dropped it into the flames. It caught with a small hiss and glimmered like a dying star before blackening completely. I stood. "That was a piece of evidence." "No, Watson," Holmes replied, turning back. "It was a ghost. And ghosts, once named, should be laid to rest." The flames danced in silence for a while, casting flickering shadows across the books, the walls, and the immortal outline of Sherlock Holmes standing before them. Then, as though the moment had never occurred, he strode toward the window, threw it open, and breathed in the clean morning air. "Well, my dear friend," he said at last, What say you to an outing? The scent of fog has been replaced with something nearly floral. To where? Someplace where no one has died, preferably. The world must be full of such places, I laughed. Lead on, Holmes. And with that, we stepped out once, again into the ever-turning wheel of London, the echoes of Witherell Hall fading behind us like the last fading notes of a song long overdue.